Professor Alan Dershowitz, thank you so much for joining this interview with us.
Thank you.
How has your trip been to Norway so far?
Well, very interesting. It's the only country that the universities have refused to invite me to deliver lectures on international law because they're afraid that I might speak about Israel, and they don't want to hear my views on Israel. The only other time I've been denied an opportunity to lecture at a university was in apartheid South Africa, when I was invited to speak at Wits University, but the government said I couldn't speak about apartheid. Here, the universities have said I can't speak about Israel. They don't want to hear my centrist, moderate, two-state solution point of view about the Middle East. They're very satisfied with the consensus anti-Israel point of view that seems to dominate on campuses. But fortunately, the students insisted that I be invited, and so I've spoken to 2 student groups, and I'm about to speak to a third.
You haven't experienced that when you have traveled to England, either to anti-Israel schools there or any universities?
No, I've spoken at more than 100 universities around the world. This is the only country that has refused to invite me to speak. When I went to Bergen, the dean was unavailable to say hello. When I was at the University of Oslo, I was not greeted by any faculty member at all. And clearly, what's in effect is an unofficial boycott of Jewish speakers who represent a pro-Israel point of view. If you're Jewish and you hate Israel, you're welcome with open arms. But if you're a Jewish speaker who wants to present a moderate pro-Israel point of view, there already is a boycott. It's not an official boycott, but there already is a faculty boycott, and I'm subject to it.
Yeah. We're going to get back to the situation in Norway. But first, a bit about the new situation in the Middle East, with all the uproars in the region and, of course, the revolutions that's taking place. What is your perspective on that?
Nobody knows how it's going to end up. We all would prefer if there were real democracy. There are 2 kinds of democracy. Structural democracy, people vote. Hitler was voted into office by structural democracy in 1932. Then there's functional democracy. Is there real democracy? Do people have the right to dissent? Do they have freedom of expression, freedom of religion? So far what we've seen is a movement for formal structural democracy in Egypt. But let's see if Egypt produces a real democracy. Let's see if there's a democracy in Yemen. Let's see if there's a democracy in Libya. Let's see if there's a democracy in Syria and in Jordan. It would be a wonderful thing if real democracy came to the Middle East. Right now there's only one country that has real democracy. There's only one country that doesn't have apartheid in the Middle East, and that one country is Israel, and yet it's the only country accused of apartheid. Every other country in the Middle East practices gender apartheid, sexual orientation apartheid, apartheid between Sunnis and Shias, apartheid against Christians, apartheid against other dissidents.
Iran calls all these uproars an Islamic revolution. Are they right?
I hope not. We saw what happened with an Islamic revolution in Iran. It set back rights of women. It set back rights of gays. It set back right of dissent. Iran is in a much worse situation for the people than it was even under the dictatorship of the Shah. So that's not a revolution. That's a reaction. That's a bringing back of the governments to the 14th and 15th century.
The Norwegian government, including Minister of Foreign Affairs Jonas Gahr Støre, regard the Jewish settlements in the West Bank and the Jewish neighborhoods in East Jerusalem as contrary to international law. Is this a common perception among international law experts, and what is your perspective?
No, it's not. For example, the Norwegian view would be that Israel's occupation of the Wailing Wall, the holiest place in Judaism, is illegal. If you take that argument to its logical conclusion, the Jewish quarter, which has been in Jewish hands since the time of the Bible, would be illegally occupied. It's a very complicated issue. What part is legal, what part is not legal? But remember, the important point is Israel has offered to end the occupation. And all they want in return is for Palestinians to recognize Israel's right to exist as the nation state of the Jewish people. It's the refusal to recognize Israel's rights that is illegal under international law. And that brings about the occupation, not the opposite.
You said something yesterday when you lectured in Bergen, or was it 2 days ago maybe? That international law must be equal to everyone.
That's right.
What would you say to those who demand more of Israel because it is a democratic state and should be held to high regards?
Well, first of all, that means that you're holding the people of Egypt and the people of the Palestinian Authority and the people of Libya, you're giving them fewer rights. It's a double standard. Why aren't the people of Libya entitled to the same rights as the Palestinians? Why aren't the Palestinians entitled to the same rights in relation to their own government? Why isn't Hamas? If you hold Hamas to a lower standard, or the Palestinian Authority to a lower standard, you're giving fewer rights to the people. Norway is well known for equality. Why should it change its approach to equality only when it comes to the Jewish state? In any event, Israel is held to a higher standard and complies with the highest standard. It has the best judicial system in the world. It probably has one of the best and most sensitive militaries in the world. It has a very high standard of human rights, even compared to the United States and Norway. If Norway were being attacked today by rockets from Sweden, it would be responding much the way Israel responds. Every democratic nation would respond in much the same way.
The Socialist Party, which is a junior member of the Norwegian government, supports Palestinians' demand of right to return for the 1948 refugees and their descendants. What is your comment?
Well, even most Palestinians don't support the right of return. The Palestinian Authority has made it clear that the right of return is never going to be satisfied. If there were a right of return, there would also be a right of return for 700,000 Jews who were expelled from Arab countries. Nobody's talking about that right of return. How about the right of return of Sudeten Germans to go back to Czechoslovakia? How about the right of the 2 million Germans who were expelled from Kaliningrad after the Second World War? How about the hundreds of thousands of people who were expelled in the exchange of land between India and Pakistan and on Cyprus? Why only this right of return, which is 60 years old? The Socialist Party of Norway has become an enemy of peace, has made it harder to make peace. They also favor boycotts of Israel. They favor working with terrorist organizations. They are part of the problem, not part of the solution. In 1993, Norway was regarded as an appropriate place for the Oslo Accords because Norway was regarded as a neutral country. Today, with the extremes of the Socialist Party, Norway is regarded as an enemy of peace, an enemy of democracy, an enemy of liberalism. It's a terrible tragedy that Norway has been pushed into that extreme view by its labor unions in many ways and by its Socialist Party.
Speaking of the Norwegian government, what would your message be to the Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg if he accepted to meet you?
Well, first, I would urge him to accept to meet me. And again, this is the only country in the world that I've been turned down for meetings with leaders. In every other country that I go to, I'm invited to meet the leaders, the heads of the country. Here, I've only met with minority parties. And the reason is simple, because of my views on Israel. There is an effect, a cultural, an academic, and intellectual boycott against pro-Israel views. And I would urge the Prime Minister of Norway to side with democracies, to side with a government that supports women's rights, to side with a government that supports gay rights, to side with a government that supports environmental rights, rather than supporting Hamas, which supports terrorism, the oppression of women, the oppression of gays, the oppression of Christians. Norway is on the wrong side of history on this issue. It's on the wrong side of morality. It's on the wrong side of democratic values, and Norway is marginalizing itself in the international community by its extreme views on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Why doesn't Norway urge the Palestinians to come and negotiate? Why didn't they urge the Palestinians to accept the Camp David offers of statehood? Why didn't they urge the Palestinians to accept Ehud Olmert's offer in 2007 and 2008? Instead of constantly only pushing Israel, today it's in a good position to push the Palestinians to make peace with Israel, to recognize Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. That would be an affirmative step that Norway could take to bring itself back into the mainstream of the international community. Today it is outside of the mainstream of the international community.
And the government was, of course, one of the first to open dialogue with Hamas when they was elected, and they still want the international community to dialogue with Hamas.
But it's interesting because Norway is ambivalent about this. The foreign minister lied about his contact with Hamas. First, he denied that he had any phone calls with Hamas, and then when the head of Hamas disclosed that he had had phone calls, he made some phony excuse about it. So you see a lot of ambivalence on the part of Norway about dealing with a terrorist organization that oppresses women. What I don't understand is why there aren't boycott efforts directed against Hamas. Shouldn't a liberal democracy like Norway be opposed to a regime that kills its opponents, tortures its opponents, tortures gays, kills gays, murders Christians, demeans women? Why is Norway on that side? Why are they perceived as being in bed with the enemies of democracy?
But it's not just in Norway that criticism against Israel grows, but in all of Europe, as a matter of fact.
No. Norway is worse. See, the difference is, in other countries in Europe, there's criticism of specific Israeli policies. Norway, for example, look at the petition that was signed by 119 professors at Trondheim University. It starts that since 1948, the state of Israel has occupied Palestinian lands. So in Norway, there is an attack on the very legitimacy of the state of Israel. When you support Hamas, you attack Israel's existence because the Hamas charter calls for the end of Israel. There's an enormous difference between attitudes in Norway on the one hand and attitudes in all of the rest of Europe. Who could have imagined 100 years ago, 60 years ago, that Israel's best friends in Europe would be Germany and Poland, and its worst enemy would be Norway? Who would imagine that the worst anti-Semitism in all of Europe would be in Norway? Who would imagine that the former Prime Minister of Norway would criticize the President of the United States for appointing a Jew to be his chief of staff? He didn't say an Israeli. He didn't say a supporter of Israel. The very fact that President of the United States appointed a Jew, he said, made it harder for peace. That's bigotry. That's anti-Semitism. That's prejudice. Norway is one of the only countries in the world, the first country in the world. It allows the slaughter of whales. It allows the slaughter of seals. The only time it cares about animal rights is when it comes to Jewish ritual law. Jewish slaughter is the only form that's prohibited in Norway. It permits halal food. It permits, as I said, the killing of seals. It has a long history of antagonism to the Jewish people, to Jewish values. Its behavior during the Holocaust is coming under great study today. It started anti-Semitism well before the Nazis started anti-Semitism in Germany. And, people told me when I came to Norway, it has a history of anti-Semitism. They're wrong. It's not history. It's current events.
But polls in the U.S. show that the support of Israel is growing in the last years. What do you think is the main difference between America and Norway?
I think, first of all, a lot of the anti-Israel attitudes in Norway are also anti-American attitudes. I think some of the left-wing parties don't like America, don't like American values, and Israel is seen as an ally of America. Second, there is the history of anti-Semitism, to single out the Jewish state for the kind of criticism, not criticism, but demonization, reflects a deep-seated hatred of the Jewish state, the Jewish nation, which America has never had. And support for Israel in America is stronger than it's ever been, even among young people. And because America really supports democracy. Now, Americans are critical of Israeli policies, specific Israeli policies. I'm critical of specific Israeli policies. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a hatred of Israel that I see when I speak on college campuses here that you just don't see anywhere else in Europe. Norwegian people have to understand Norway is unique. It's not like the rest of Europe. I've been all over Europe. This is the worst country in all of Europe when it comes to Israel and when it comes to Jews and when it comes to supporting democratic values and when it comes to supporting Hamas.
Back to the Middle East. In an interview with Jerusalem Post last year, after meeting with the PA Prime Minister Salam Fayyad, you expressed great excitement.
That's right.
Is he the hope for peace in the Palestinian side, and do you believe he is willing to fight the PA incitements against Israel?
I do. I think if Salam Fayyad could sit down personally with Benjamin Netanyahu, and neither of them had to worry about their others, their street, their parties, we can have peace very, very quickly. The problem is the difference between Fayyad and Netanyahu is the popularly elected Prime Minister of Israel. Fayyad is the appointed Prime Minister. He is not elected. He doesn't have support by the street. He doesn't have widespread support among the Palestinian masses. So he doesn't speak for the Palestinians, whereas Benjamin Netanyahu does speak for the Israelis.
What is your take on President Mahmoud Abbas's wish to form a new coalition with Hamas?
If it works, if he could get Hamas to give up their charter, which not only calls for the destruction of the Jewish state, but also the Jewish people, it blames the Jews on the French Revolution. It blames the Jews for the drug trade in the world. It's a basic, bigoted, anti-Semitic screed. If he can get them to accept the arrangements arrived at Oslo, if he can get them to accept Israel's right to exist, then there's no reason not to bring Hamas into a coalition. But if Hamas continues to support the destruction of a United Nations state, then there's no use talking to them. Look, I think the most important point is that Israel has to make peace with the Palestinians. It's going to be much easier to make peace with the Palestinians than it would be to make peace with the professors at Trondheim, because the Palestinians are much more pragmatic, whereas the professors who sign this petition want to see the end of Israel. And that's not going to happen. And so that's not productive.
Last question. If the Muammar Gaddafi regime of Libya falls, would that affect Israel in some way, you think?
Well, Gaddafi is, and Libya has never really had any close connection to Israel. They've mouthed off on anti-Israel attitudes, and I don't think Israel has a particular stake. I think Israel would rather be surrounded by democracies than by tyrannies. Gaddafi, of course, is a murderer. Murderer of Americans, a murderer of Europeans, a murderer of airline passengers. Everybody would like to see the Gaddafi regime topple. But what we're seeing now is a civil war, and Israel has no real stake. Israel has a much greater stake in what happens in Egypt, what happens in Jordan, what happens in Syria, what happens in Saudi Arabia, what happens in Bahrain, and ultimately what happens in Iran. Israel's greatest enemy in the world today is Iran. And Iran is the only country capable of really bringing about the destruction of Israel through dirty bomb, through a nuclear attack, through giving terrorists weapons of mass destruction. And Iran is the greatest enemy of peace in the world today.
Thank you so much for this interview, Professor Dershowitz. I hope you enjoy the rest of your stay.
Thank you.